Dr. Hence Clarke presenting Measured Doses, the Future of Cannabis.
All right, everyone, thank you very much. For those of you that were here about an hour and a half ago, we're going to kind of pick up and continue on talking a little bit not only about where we sit from the medical side now, but I think the evolution as we move into metered dosing. And so what I'll do for the first 5 minutes or so is I'll give you a little bit of the review of some of the evidence that we touched on, and then we'll really look at where the industry sits now and where I think we can start to revolutionize it and move it into that direction where we can marry what's happening in the recreational world and what we do for our patients as they walk into the hospital setting. So we kind of touched on the overall landscape in Canada. We know that we have the political side. We know that we have a lot of booths here with our licensed producers. We've got significant pharmaceutical interest, lobby groups. The science piece is what's going to drive us where we need to get in terms of making this safe for patients. And we already touched on for a whole 45 minutes kind of the role that this can potentially play in terms of substitution and with respect to the opioid crisis. So, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about this scientific evidence. I'm going to talk about the gap that exists, and I'll give you a little bit more detail into what that role is for that patient who walks in the door with that clinical gap and unbeknowingly, potentially doesn't tell their healthcare team, well, I use cannabis, I use it daily, and now I'm presenting for a procedure. I'm now heading down the road of being hospitalized for days and what that might actually look like. And then we'll give you that roadmap in terms of where I think we want to land. And so, again, another kind of picturesque overview of where we sit and where we're going to focus. So you saw this in the last, near the tail end of the last talk. And again, for those of you that weren't here, this is probably one of the better systematic reviews of the randomized controlled trials that exist in terms of cannabis from a medical use perspective. 29 studies were reviewed, 22 of them were positive, and this is where we've actually taken a lot of the inroads into the pain world from the data that exists to date. Here's another more recent one done by some of my colleagues actually at UHN, and they looked at medical marijuana, and not just inhalational marijuana, but various other formulations, and they said there was some evidence as well for low-dose medical cannabis in refractory neuropathic pain. And, you know, but generalizing to all conditions is probably not supported currently. And so I think as we move forward, we're going to see that there are lots of ways that we can actually identify specific subpopulations and start to look at some of these formulations moving forward. This is, again, a kind of a repeat slide in terms of, you know, some of the weaning substitution standpoint of one of our patients post-liver transplant. He was on higher doses of opioids, stayed with his medical cannabis, was going to continue using recreational, but not sure how to go about doing this, didn't know how this interacted with his anti-rejection drugs, and sure enough, we got him started on with one of the licensed producers, uses you know, the different strains in the day versus at nighttime, that the sativas, et cetera, that will help him sleep. And so to just review some of the you know, plants and phytocannabinoids and all of the derivatives that we know that mother plant that we all like to talk about in terms of its specific genetics and understanding what comes out of these mother plants, we all seem to still be fixated on delta-9 THC. And delta-9 THC is one of several compounds, and I think we're going to start to see that as we evolve this down the pharma side into the drug discovery side, that it's going to be one of several mediators. So this is our current landscape. This is clearly what we get when we dance with any one of the licensed producers right now. You'll get your product shipped to your house. And here are some of the other formulations that when you talk to some of the drug discovery folks, and the only university in the US, actually NIH funded to look at cannabis research, is out of Ole Miss. And they've identified a bunch of products and have patents for some of these in specific medical conditions that I won't get into today, but you know, delta-8, for example, is one of the things that we think is very important in the topical landscape that you won't hear a lot about at the moment. But for sure, as we move forward, you'll start to hear more of this. We all know how we have to convert THCA to THC, and that whole decarboxylation process includes heat. And so the optimization of this process will be the cornerstone of moving this into the pharma space and into the commercialization at large scale. And so the companies that are optimizing this will be the ones that actually move forward. And you start to see, a lot of literature and papers being written as to where this may all fit in and what that pain pathway looks like. Well, the one thing we know in pain is there is no ubiquitous drug that will be a fix-all and a cure-all. And we know that depending on the pathway, depending on the condition, you could be looking at your TRPV1 receptors, you could be looking at your 5-HT process, and how these all interplay will have to be teased out as we kind of move things forward and start to focus in on some of these phytocannabinoids, et cetera. And when we talk about what those might be, we have absolutely no data right now other than what we know in terms of the THC and the CBD piece. And we talk a lot, and I hear it a lot being spoken of, even in the showroom, of the entourage effect. And there is so much more than these two molecules, but we have no clue what those entourage mediators might be. And this is where we have to start looking at people's plasma levels and understand where the inroads can be made in terms of where we move. So where do we sit today compared to where the science part of this sits, and where are we moving to over the next little while? Well, it's just been maybe over a year or so now that we moved from walking into any dispensary and filling your script to now potentially having to use an LP's script, having it faxed over to that LP, and now you can get a picture of whatever those types of oils are. We're now talking about new companies bringing out capsules. Some of them are over-encapsulated capsules, whatever that is, but it's now moving into a space that clearly starts to look different. And where is the science, and what do we know? When I prescribe someone a script and they're consuming 1 or 2 grams a day, what does that mean when they get seen by another doc who says you shouldn't be smoking that and you should be using an oil? We clearly know there's going to be a pharmacologic difference in terms of time to peak onset. We also know that, how long that stays and how it's excreted. Most of it will be excreted by your kidneys, but the length of time and what that specific composition is in terms of whether it's exactly what should be on that label versus not will change significantly based on your producers, et cetera. And so the big conversation that's always had is, but this is a plant product. And how do you make this into a product that can be commercialized? And where is that DIN aspect? And there's a very different discussion that can be had, because the ACMPR talks about a specific dose, and then we know as we see clinical outcomes and we give patients different doses that there are threshold levels for things like driving, threshold levels for things like just functioning on a daily basis based on individual differences. And there is data there that just absolutely is waiting to happen, and we're talking about building some of this. And this is another way of encapsulating what the physician culture is right now. And so 12% are happily prescribing. Some of them are only prescribing cannabis now as their means of existence in the physician world. 35% say, no thanks, never going to be there, it's illegal for me, which we know is not true, to prescribe. And 52% are really waiting for that information and that data to take us down the road of helping our patients and figuring out the niche that this is going to land in. So here's part of the angst, and let's be clear. As a doc, when you send someone out with a prescription, and they come back and they're consuming their lollipops and their gummy bears and their different cakes without the knowledge of what percentage of THC is in this, and it may say on the sticker, but they have no correlate other than what they've consumed, they're not sure even how much they take, it makes many docs take a little step back and say, well, hold on a second, where's the medicine here? If I can't know what you're going to consume, well, that's my last script. Good luck, see you later. And sure, you'll find another clinic down the road to continue you down this pathway. And then you have, I didn't want to name any of the dispensaries, you have simple Globe and Mail articles and exposés, and where you're finding 3 of 7 of these dispensaries having pesticides in their products, and or when you actually take a look at the THC count on those bottles or on the gummy bears and on the brownies, some of them are even 1/5 away from where they claim to be and what those products have. And so clearly, if you're going to move this outside of bringing that bag of weed into the hospital, you're certainly going to need to be more consistent in terms of your product lines, in terms of ensuring that that product that I write on my prescription pad is the same 4 months later as it is today. And I think the industry is working towards that, but it has a long way to go. And then, of course, this is what docs know, right? Docs know that if you take cannabis, you're going to have drug-drug interactions with a whole host of things. Where that data comes from, we're not sure, but we know with CYP proteins and liver enzymes are revved up. And we also know that people who clearly, and it's more so when people are on cannabis and they come off cannabis and they walk into the institution, their heart rate is in the hundreds, their blood pressure is low, we can't keep it up. You see folks with the typical corneal changes and all of the psychological potential hallucinogenic effects that folks may end up with. And this is a lot, we talked a lot about this in the last talk, so I'm not going to focus here. Just giving you the picture in terms of why you walk into that doc's office and they say, sorry, it's illegal for me to prescribe, I'm not gonna go in that direction. But I think things are changing, and we know that the patient's safety is at the forefront of this, and we know that we've seen the pictures of that little girl who potentially has an epileptic disorder, the person with osteoarthritic pain and joint pain ubiquitously, that they can use these cannabinoid products to treat themselves, and clearly as we move into the chemotherapy, induced nausea, vomiting, these have been mainstays, and some of these areas will become mainstays over the next several years. And how? Well, we start to look at what this has to do from a physiologic perspective. We start to understand that it has a presynaptic role in various neurons so that we can dampen down those neurotransmitters that are released. And typically, that's also, as you know, that opioid nidus of action, and there's clearly a synergistic effect as we talk about these medications moving forward. So when we talk about our CB1 receptors in particular, I think we touched on last time that they're actually more endocannabinoid receptors in the brain than there are opioid receptors, and it's something that many people actually aren't that familiar with. And we know they're one of the major classes of neuromodulators, and the CB1 is primarily located in many of our CNS neurons. When we look at the CB2 receptors, those are the ones that are isolated in the periphery. And we know that THC selectively targets the CB1 and cannabidiol selectively targets the CB2. Cannabidiol is also an antagonistic effect sometimes at the CB1 receptor. And so what's interesting in the pain world is when we start to administer these drugs to patients exogenously, you can see that they have different effects based on the strains, and that's where you get into those discussions. And I'm not sure that we have a ton of evidence to tell people that you must land on a CBD product, because those that we try to do that with without that THC component quite often fail, I'll be honest with you. So I think there is definitely an interplay between the both. And I see you nodding your head from the last talk, and you're probably an expert in some of this and helping patients down this road, where some docs are just at the doorstep in terms of figuring some of this out. And so the patient advocacy and the patient education part is for sure an important aspect that we have to talk about. And so, you know, it's kind of seen as a motherhood type of neurotransmitter. So as a benzodiazepine is an overall CNS depressant, that's what I think we can look at when we talk about those cannabinoid and the CB1 type effects. And so to tell people that you're on this medication, you're now walking into an institution, you should stop this, makes absolutely no sense. And you're going to actually upregulate the nervous system, as you see in pain patients who are on their medications and have them stop for a procedure. They become very upregulated, and you see this, what we kind of have now started to term cannabis withdrawal. You know, if someone comes into an operation now and they haven't told me they're smoking cannabis and they're smoking 2 or 3 grams a day, they're in a dangerous spot. So one of the things we've started to talk about is to ensure that physicians, as they start to come in, given where we sit as a society, understanding that this is one of those issues in society where when you take a poll of 5,000 people, 85% say, 1, this drug should be legal. 2, 75% say that not only should it be illegal, it should be treated as a medicine. So if we're going to treat it as a medicine and we have this much of a nidus in the public domain, we better start embracing it and understand how we deal with it as they come forward. And if you ask me, individuals need to be disclosing, physicians need to know how to deal with it, and one of those things is we clearly need to understand that individuals should be staying on it for short bursts if they're coming in and out, especially in a day patient scenario. You should not be telling somebody to stop their cannabis the day before if this is something that is part of their central nervous system and floating around in their serum at specific plasma levels moving forward. But this is controversial. It sounds straightforward here. It is controversial because we know that if you smoke, you have to stop that 2 weeks before. And so you can see how there's going to be some pushback as I talk about some of these things as we move forward. So what doses? So we know there's hundreds of different strains available. We know based on which LP you look up tomorrow, there may have been a strain today and it's disappeared by tomorrow. And my prescription pad has said you need 10% CBD and 7% THC. Good luck finding that out there currently in the marketplace. And you know, as we tease out the THC and the CBD component, who am I talking to as they're in front of me? And so there are those of you sitting right in front of me that are cannabis naive and those of you that have been using cannabis for many years. And so when I'm dealing with the cannabis user for a long period of time, I know that if I were to write them a prescription of less than 10 or 15%, it would be an absolute joke. You'd come back to me, you say, you've wasted my money, doc, and I'm just happy getting my cannabis wherever it was I was getting. But now you take my 56-year-old osteoarthritic patient that walks into my clinic tomorrow because of what she's seen on TV, because of this amazing Lift Expo, and they say to me, doc, what do you think about medical cannabis, just under their breath, because they actually want to go down this road. And if they were to get their hands, because I've prescribed them a low-dose THC, and this has happened to me, and they end up sending their script somewhere, or they get back a 20% THC product, when 4% was where we were sitting 15 years ago. That was our max strength THC. And now we're almost 15% higher than we were. I've had my patients call me from Emerge. So let's understand that we need to really get a handle on what our patients are using, how they get into this, and where they end up landing. And so the naive individual interested in using medical cannabis as a medicine is very different than that individual who has been using it for a long time. And clearly, anytime you start using greater than 5 grams, and I'm sure I'm going to get lots of pushback here, it's usually not a good setting, and quite often that individual is probably not using it all himself. And so now you want to talk about the opioid crisis, and I'm going to be very, very controversial here. Maybe in 20 years we'll be talking about the vegetable crisis, okay? So let's just understand that there has to be checks and balances as we go down these roads. And so here's where I'm going to land right now. So if you walk into the hospital now, and you are one of many people here that are smoking 2-3 grams a day, and you don't disclose this, and you have a procedure, and on day one I walk by and I've given you one of these pain pumps, and for some reason you're using 3 times as much as the guy in the bed next to you, and you've had a relatively inert operation, but you forgot to mention that you were using 2 or 3 grams of cannabis, what do I do for you? Can't tell you take your entire hospital bed, wheel yourself 10 feet out, and start to inhale again. All I have for you is that thing on the top right now in the hospital, which is called Nabilone. And what that will give you is about 2 nanograms per mil. And let's say you were smoking a dried bud of 4%, which was our max percentage about 15 years ago. Your plasma concentration levels are 18 nanograms per mil. Think about someone smoking 25%. You're looking at 5 times that in terms of what we can deliver. And I can give you this to just kind of take the edge off that cannabis. And so we need to understand how, as this moves forward, we can actually protect some of you that come into these institutional settings from a pharmacological perspective, because as I said in my last talk, I don't see that day happening very soon where you're going to get to bring your bag in, okay? So back up there, this is important. And so what's important here is now these are bispectral analyses of what are in the various products. And what you want to be consuming is B. You want to know that the products you have here has a peak at the CBD and a peak at the THC. What you don't want to be seeing is that what you've consumed has a whole bunch of THCA, which you're not going to be able to convert once you ingest that. And here's where we sit in terms of the discrepancy of what's out there, what we need, and where we can prescribe so we understand what's happening. And so how does that move there? Well, I actually do some work with another senior colleague of mine, Dr. Kotra, and he's actually just won an award looking at what those molecules are in our Canadian marketplace. And this is simply looking at products in the Canadian marketplace. And I can tell you that as much as you see delta-9 THC and CBD, there's CBN, there's CBG, and from the plant product to what we're seeing in human plasma, there's really only about 63 compounds. So you want to talk about your entourage effect and talk about 485 compounds, well, we're down to about 63 now. And so when we start looking at those 63, we can start looking at those segues into where we can develop novel compounds, where we can actually move into figuring out what that entourage effect might be. Just simply looking at hemp seeds on the grocery store shelves, okay? Do an analysis, a bispectral analysis, and you're seeing a variance from 19% of what's put on that label to 770%. There was a case of one pediatric scenario where they consumed too many hemp seeds, taken to immersion, a little sedated, and when they actually did plasma concentration level, the THC levels were pretty high. So we've got a long way to go before we can get to a place that I think everyone is comfortable with. And so, you know, this is kind of the take-home message here. If we can figure out how we optimize that extraction process, get rid of that THC piece of the pie that you're going to consume as a patient, end up with a purified product, now we can start talking about developing capsules, developing different formulations such as, you know, sublingual formulations, topicals, patches, and I've seen lots of that here, but now let's actually get that early data to potentially go down the DIN road or potentially not. As long as it gets into the marketplace and there's safety data with it, you're going to see a lot more docs being very happy to prescribe these products as we move forward. So we're going to summarize here. And I think we still can appreciate that that clinical gap and the knowledge gap still exists. The clinical gap, I think, is much bigger than the knowledge gap. So I think the knowledge is starting to disseminate based on public opinion, based on federal law changes, et cetera, that this is here to stay. But how we close that clinical gap is going to be in the hands of developing products that are consistent, that our patients know they'll be able to take, and then again, the world becomes your oyster in terms of where these things land. So, you know, if you want to get the greatest acceptance, and again, I'm only talking about the medical world, in terms of consistency, science, and patient safety, that's where the tick mark's going to land. And so the only way you're going to do that is to partner with specific companies that produce quality evidence and metered dose products, which the medical community can still prescribe to lead you down that path when you walk into institutions. What you're doing in the world is a whole nother story, but that is probably the only way in terms of protecting you long term. And so, any questions? Happy to take them. See one up here, Dave? I think he's coming somewhere with the mic. Did he run away? Yeah, just keep going? All right, so I'll repeat the question for you. Read it one more time, sorry.
When it comes to CBD versus THC, how do you differentiate the dosing of the starting point?
Okay. So the question is, when you come to CBD and THC, how do you differentiate the starting point of each patient? And then again, that's where the history comes in, right? So if you are a long-term user and you know you've been smoking cannabis recreationally, your starting point for any condition is a magnitude set point, maybe 2 or 3 times higher than somebody who isn't. It also depends on your condition, right? So again, this is very anecdotal just because I've treated a lot of people, but we don't have the science to back what I'm about to say. So I'm gonna put that out there before I get filmed and this goes out to the rest of the world. If someone has an inflammatory condition, so let's think about things like rheumatoid arthritis. Let's think about things like inflammatory bowel disease. Things that flare up, get better, flare up, get better. So it's kind of a roller coaster ride. What we've been treating most of these things with consistently and constantly have been opioids. And that ride of ramping somebody up and ramping somebody down, as we've seen, is not that easy. Cannabis, on the other hand, is certainly something that you can give someone that they can use for a period of time, put aside, use for a period of time, and put aside. And an inflammatory type condition, you want to start with a reasonable amount of CBD and some THC there as well, because again, CBD alone often fails, okay? But they then have to be the judge of their cognitive state and how they move forward. If you're talking solely type of nociceptive stimulated clinical scenarios, like for example, I really think about people with psoriatic arthritis, that it gets really bad really fast, then you can start to ramp up the THC a little bit higher, a little faster. Again, to get them through that bridge, whether it's a week or two, to get out the other side to continue to function. And so that's kind of how you tease out where you start from a THC and a CBD. Inflammatory-based CBD, nociceptive, kind of noxious type scenarios, more THC. A couple questions here, Dave.
You basically described this industry now going under the rigor of drug development, pharmaceutical drug development, which has costly compliance checkpoints. So in your opinion, who's going to gear up to start putting funding into this, which requires QA, compliance, regulatory filing to FDA, Health Canada? Who do you think is going to really embark to pay for this as you now create the need in the clinic?
Right. And so the need exists. So the need is there. Who embarks on that will be those first companies who start to embrace. Well, I can tell you one of those first companies clearly is one of those booths back there, the Scientus Pharma booth, okay? I can tell you that all of the other big boys in the Canadian marketplace now are gearing up to go down that road and try to play catch up because they understand how big this marketplace is. They understand that that is the only way that you're going to get into that market space is with data. There's lots of people probably in line to start heading in that direction. It's just a matter of partnering with the right people with the right knowledge to take you there. And it doesn't negate many of these other booths being part of that journey because there's early knowledge and early evidence in all of that. So as long as you have your ducks in a row and you can actually replicate what you claim to have, you're welcome to come on board for that journey, right?
Hey, doctor. What's your preferred delivery system when you prescribe? I mean, I know Canada's highly regulated in what we could do up here. What have you seen in, elsewhere in the U.S. or around the world, and where do you think it'll go in the future? I think you alluded to it in your previous discussion that everyone talks about the entourage effect, and I believe in it. The clinical data is still out there. Where do you think? What would you prefer to prescribe now? Where do you think the evolution is going to the future in the pharmaceutical world?
Wow, thanks for the question. I could probably make a 30-minute talk on that. But to start with what I do personally now, well, I practice evidence-based, right? So the evidence I have says you should be using an inhalational product. We know the peak half-life. We know where that's going to leave your system. And we know if you use it 2 or 3, 4 times a day, that you can modulate your functioning based on that and understanding those parameters. A lot of my patients, when they go and see my colleagues, they get shifted onto the oils currently because that's the new baby. And the oils are there because you don't have to smoke and you don't get all of the negative side effects of smoking, etc. But where's the data with the oils? So where do we show that excretion profile, the PK profile, the plasma levels? How do we know how much THCA versus THC? When you look at half the products, they're not consistent batch to batch. And so that's the struggle. Where do I think we're going to land? I think we're going to land in companies that have the best extraction profiles out there that can get the process away from a 5-day process to a 2 to 3 hour process that can then get it to market and scalable at a global level. And those are the winners that are probably going to move this whole field forward and move it into that realm of, okay, now you come to an institution or a pharmacy and here's what you have and here's where you're going to actually get your patient a consistent product. If you come in telling me you smoke 15% THC and I smoke 2 grams a day, I do a quick calculation. I didn't put that slide up there. What Health Canada has in their document, it says 200 milligrams a day. You show me a single product out there that can be anything more than 10 milligrams a dose. So we are nowhere in the ball game of where we need to be replacing people that are coming in on these high dose strains of THC, and we need to get there. And that's the only way you're going to get there.